Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second week of the Song of the Lark. I'm going to try not to touch my camera and turn it off 4 times. Well, I actually only turned it off 3 times last time. So I've got it propped up on a Norton. Everybody knows what a Norton is, right? It's big fat. So anyway, that's what I'm doing to prevent last week's multiple uploads. I have quite a lot of information. As with any writer of quality, the amount of critical assessment is vast. It is vast. So I'm going to start with a few things, kind of an overview. This is a critical evaluation. I'm not even sure where I got it, but it's interesting nonetheless. This author says the West and the past. One is the physical background of Willa Cather's writing. The other is its spiritual climate. Against her chosen backgrounds, she projects her stories of pioneers and artists, men and women of simple passions and creative energies. The very nature of her material determines her own values as an artist, and it's the artist that we are going to discover in Thea. To find in the people of her creation those realities of the spirit that are almost overwhelmed in the complexity and confusion of the present. The Song of the Lark, which carries Thea Kronberg from an obscure Colorado town to the concert and opera stage, is a novel rich and sustaining in homely realism. The character of Thea is drawn in part from Olive Fremstad, a Swedish-American opera singer, but there's much of Cather's own story in the experiences of her heroine. Like Thea, she made common things and disciplined effort the shaping influences of her art. Common things and disciplined effort. The story of the artist in America is usually sentimentalized or idealized. This novel is a notable exception. Let's put that up there. Though it never shared the success of some of Cather's other works, The Song of the Lark is nevertheless a rewarding and significant part of the Cather canon. The novel has been criticized, and perhaps justly so, for its unselective use of detail and episode in developing Thea's story. You probably have noticed that, and I'll point out quite a bit of it. Her detail is really fabulous. A really, really significant element of this novel. And while it was criticized for it, I think that's one of the most appealing things. I get some into the detail of her descriptions. Yet such thoroughness is also what has allowed Cather to convey so fully to the reader Thea's passionate spirit for living. Thea's growth as an artist is shown in the context of two themes that run throughout Cather's work: the invigorating spiritual significance of the Southwest and its history, and the alienation of the artistic temperament from conventional life and values. We're going to see that even a little bit today. The Song of the Lark is essentially a chronicle of the delicate awakening of the artistic sensibility and its consequent struggle to escape the limitations of a commonplace environment. We see that right off the bat with Thea. She has befriended some of the more peculiar people in her town. Um, and we see her retreating upstairs to her little attic, much like Cather did. This theme is introduced in the novel through Thea's early opposition to the standards and values of Moonstone. The young girl's friends are those who, like Thea herself, display a quality of mind and spirit for life that Moonstone conventionality interprets as either wild or eccentric or blatantly selfish. The lifestyles, and these are her friends: Dr. Archie, Old Wunsch, the piano teacher, Ray Kennedy, and Spanish Johnny, are in marked contrast to the provincial conformity and petty materialism embodied in the likes of Mrs. Livery Johnson, or the community's endorsement of Thea's less talented rival, Lily Fisher. That one's funny, isn't she? Although Taya's talent and ardent nature set her apart from the rest of her community, she finds happiness and fulfillment. So we're going to examine a few things. I just have to mark some of these things off. I lose track of what I have said to you and what I haven't. Something that was really interesting to me, and this is thanks to Jane. Um, Jane gave me, when she gave me the book to be discussed, this version of it, um, also some explanatory notes from a different edition. This was immensely helpful. We don't have that in this edition, so I'm going to talk about those notes, especially because they explain some of the points that Cather makes. So now my notes say go to page 132 in the beige book. This is Critical Essays on Willa Cather. I bought another book which is on its way. You will be the beneficiaries of that by next week. Let's hope it doesn't arrive today from Amazon right during this lecture, because as you may have seen already, my dogs just lose it when the Amazon guy comes. The first section of the Song of the Lark is entitled Friends of Childhood. And so we're going to see her friends. And Cather gives us a really beautiful description of each of them. By the way, you'll notice that I'm wearing my Packer necklace in honor of the poor Packers. Kind of snubbing my nose at the Buccaneers. But anyway, maybe you don't care about the Packers, but I do. Anyway, Friends of Childhood is the first 6 sections and covers Taya's 11th through 17th years, that period of her life when she was pure artist. I think that's really interesting. She says to Dr. Archie, I am more or less of an artist now, when she approaches the peak of her career. We'll see this later. It's not for several chapters. But then I was nothing else. So what we see her is, according to Cather, a pure artist as this child, because that's the way she's approaching her world. She has, as a girl, an aesthetic freshness which allows her to experience things wholly. Her receptivity is grounded in nature. The sand hills around Moonstone, Colorado, and the turquoise hills 10 miles off tantalize Taya with a message of freedom, courage, and aspiration. I'm not sure we're going to get to the turquoise hills today. That's the place where she and her little party go to go with Ray Kennedy, and they experience this nature. Um, The eagle living up on a windy ridge teaches her more of the spirit and desire of man than does the most ambitious man in the town below. From people she learns a great deal, but it is small in comparison with the tidings in the naked vigor of the earth. Um, one of the things that I mentioned last week in her biography was the visit that she made to her brother in Colorado. This is not Taya, but Willa Cather. She made this visit to her brother, and it seemed as if it was the opening of her mind, her receptivity. And while she did this when she was young, and she stayed there for several weeks, but she was immensely impacted by it. Let's see. Frequently, the lesson learned from man is negative. She must preserve a certain solitude, protect her feelings from the sentimental intrusions of her sister, or from the elaborate familial doings which can blot out her identity. Um, I think I mentioned this last week too, that in some places, some critics say that Willa grew up with 3 siblings, whereas in other places she grew up with 6 siblings, much like what Taya experiences. And you can see in this tiny little overcrowded house how one's personality could in fact be blotted out. She must hold her own against the cheap taste and rivalry of Lily Fisher. I think those scenes about Lily Fisher are hilarious. Who connives to get a showstopper at the church Christmas concert and would sing anything which pleases the crowd. More frequently, the experience of childhood positively contributes to the development of her aesthetic sense. Among Moonstone friends, Taya realizes that human relationships are matters of the heart and not applications of social and religious tenets. So here, there's a few notes here about each one of these um, friendships that she develops. One is with Spanish Johnny, the unreliable alcoholic. Taya comes nearest to the elemental impulse of the earth with Spanish Johnny, as it is echoed in man. The music Johnny makes on a mandolin is frenzied and exceptionally skillful, but its strength and beauty reside in the racial consciousness which is at the heart of his songs. Um, in the second part of the novel, after Taya returns from a year of formal study in Chicago, she identifies the emotional freedom she enjoys with the Mexicans through the ethnic current in their music. And their music appears early on in the story. She hears it from their community, which is on the outskirts of Moonstone. Among Mexicans, and especially with Johnny, music is a felt reality and a common expression. What I think is particularly interesting in the first part of this novel, where Cather examines um, Taya's friends, is that the bits that become Taya, the magnificent artist, are beginning to show themselves. So we're seeing music in Wunsch, in the piano teacher, and the discipline of practicing 4 hours, but we also see the artistry and the musicality in Spanish Johnny. We see also Ray Kennedy, this 30-year-old guy, which, currently this would throw up a lot of red flags, but Ray Kennedy has his eye on her even when she's 12. Um, but in the novel, this is not made to sound like it's peculiar. He just is. So Ray Kennedy is a railroader romancer, brings the young artist to other beginnings, those of history, and pay attention to the stories he tells. From his tales of old Mexico and the Southwest, Taya learns how man pulled himself up from a primitive to a civilized creature. About the cliff dwellers and their cities, Ray says, "You be." I can't get my notes. I'm still using jillions of these. You begin to feel what the human race has been up against from the beginning. This is Ray's speech. There's something mighty elevating about those old habitations. Ray's own life has little of the heroism of his dreams, but he is able to communicate heroic ideals. The meaning of the human story is his gift to Taya. I think that's a really important observation because each one of these um, slightly peculiar friends of hers, adults and people kind of on the outskirts, each one of them has an artistic gift to convey to her. As a child, she instinctively comprehends the timelessness of man's fight for the civilized things which make him man, because she has within herself a yearning to create, and because she requires direct contact with the vital source of life Ray speaks of. Later, of course, she does live fully by the natural pull of things in the Southwest, actually immersed in the life water of the earth, and the conception of art which Taya achieves during this baptism as an enlargement of Ray's idealism. The baptism that this author speaks of is from is what she experienced when she visited her brother in the Southwest. Um, it's kind of like some of the music of John Denver. I'm just going to say, he says that when he was um, in his 20s, he was born when he discovered the mountains. I don't know if you like John Denver, but if it comes on the radio in the car, I can sing so loud, so long as there's nobody in there. So another friend of hers is Howard Archie. And this is her closest friend. And he is patterned after the doctor that Cather befriended when she was young. She was a teenager and she apprenticed herself to the doctor in her own town, thinking that she was eventually going to become a doctor. So here he is. This is Archie. He is too timid to call a halt to an unsuccessful marriage and to leave a town he finds limiting. Cather has these funny bits about some of these characters, and Archie's wife, Mrs. Archie, is quite the character. We'll get to her. She's a thin and unattractive woman, among other things. He cares for her, meaning Taya. He cares for her from cradle to artistic coronation. The intellectual of the town, Archie is able to explain questions of religion, personal responsibility, and human destiny, which puzzle Taya. And so that is his gift to her. He makes no concessions to her young mind. He speaks maturely. Then we have Wunsch, and I believe I'm saying that correctly. The piano teacher, another peculiar guy who appears on the horizon. We'll see this. He just appears. He just comes from nowhere and then takes up living in one of the villagers' homes. He's the piano teacher, physically lame like the other three Moonstone friends. He has the most to do with Taya's artistic preparation. Professor Wunsch gives Taya all he can. That would be quite a bit for a normal child, but not enough for one intending to study the piano seriously. As desire outweighs discipline in his personality, and we'll probably see that today, where we see his desire appearing from nowhere, and then he shuts it down. He's too afraid of it. Um, so his teaching emphasizes emotion and ignores, except in a wayward fashion, the literature of the piano. Music is Wunsch's life and love. Because it is not submitted to discipline of any kind, it has become an inadequate source of livelihood and an emotional frustration to Wunsch himself. The imbalance of his musicianship is not without a compensatory benefit, however. His name states that Taya receives him from him. Desire. That's what Wunsch means. I had to look that up. I don't know much about German. I took German when I was in grade school, but all I can do is count. Doesn't really help us. So, okay. So those are those friends. I have my little tabs here. They tell me see later. We'll come to these things. Let's see, page characters. So we did that. All right. So here's a little bit about the American Southwest. This article is by someone named Max Despain. And I can't remember if I know where he comes from. It doesn't list it doesn't list a university, but this is from a text called Critical Insights. The title of it is Creative Genius, Willa Cather's Characters and the Influence of the American Desert Southwest. Here's the title. Does you want to write it down? We cannot emphasize the importance of the American Southwest and this kind of awakening that occurs to Cather, and which we see her trace in the personality of Taya. In 1912, Willa Cather spent several weeks visiting her brother, as I mentioned, Douglas, in Winslow, Arizona, marking her first visit to the desert in the Southwest. Soon the American Southwest would be an important site of creative and artistic growth for characters in 3 of her novels. We've seen this already. The expansive, complex landscape, rich with ancient heritage and massive land formations, was a perfect proving ground for her ideas about how creative genius grows. That is the point of this novel. How does creative genius develop? Cather describes her writing as trying to achieve something that cannot be put into words. She says, "It is the the inexplicable presence of the thing not named that gives high quality to the novel." Cather's literary response to the American desert in the Southwest reflects her personal growth as an artist. Cather understands that creating imagined identities from Native American cultural ruins and remains, such as the Panther Canyon cliff dwellings for Taya Kronberg in The Song of the Lark, influences these characters' identities. Ultimately, Cather uses the Southwest landscape to inspire her characters to their versions of creative genius, be it as an artist, and in another novel, an engineer, or even a priest in Death Comes to the Archbishop. The impact of the desert and its influence on Willa Cather's personal creative process cannot be underestimated. So I've mentioned it 3 or 4 times. Let's see what this. Okay. 1. Cather constructs ways of understanding identity under the pressure of the unique southwestern landscape so that her characters find they have new perspectives on themselves as they undergo important changes in identity. And that is, in fact, why Cather includes that little adventure that she and Ray Kennedy and Spanish Johnny and Spanish Johnny's wife, they take this trip. And I think 2 of the brothers, you take a trip, and you would think as you're plodding along through it, why is this here? How does this move the plot along? And in fact, it is the moment of awakening. I don't know if you've probably, everybody has probably been to Arizona. I went to Arizona when my kids were little, and there had been an unusual rainstorm. And by the time we got there, the rainstorm had caused a bloom in the floral elements of cactuses, and in a way, everybody kept saying, "Oh, this is so unusual." You would see those big, huge cacti with the arms that go up like this, and it would have pink and yellow flowers. It was absolutely magnificent, and I think this is what Cather must have experienced. In the Song of the Lark, Cather prepares us to read Taya Kronberg's time in the canyon in the Song of the Lark as a process towards artistic genius when the author emphasizes Taya's need for a physical involvement to anchor experiences and remember them as if they had been part of herself, and that self is emphasized. Literally, Cather requires Taya to pretend to be a Native American from the past as a new place from which she can look back with new perspective on herself. Make a note to myself. As I piece these together, my articles, I like them to coordinate with the text as we read it. So then I have one more article, and I'm only going to give you some bits of it. This is really interesting. So, setting is important in the novel, and we're going to visit several places. She begins in Moonstone, then goes to Chicago, Panther Canyon, and New York City as she makes this journey in her artistic development. So as we change setting, I will return to these analyses of location. Moonstone is the fictional town set in sandhills of Colorado, closely modeled on Red Cloud, where Willa Cather spent her late elementary school and high school years. Her parents lived in this town for the rest of their lives, providing her with numerous opportunities to revisit and refresh her memory about the people and places that appear continuously in her fiction. Thea Kronborg, the central character in The Song of the Lark, starts her artistic journey in Moonstone. As the daughter of a Scandinavian Methodist minister, she is somewhat inhibited by her family's small town religious values and the routine 19th century expectations of women. Although, and we see this in the daughter, Taya's older sister, who is firmly marching in her mother's footsteps and is, I think she's described as the second lieutenant, or she's her mother's lieutenant. It was kind of funny. We'll get to that today. Um, Although Cather herself was frustrated by similar small town conventions, she recognized that key persons in Red Cloud had helped her in her education and her eventual success as a writer, and she created similar characters in Moonstone to provide Taya with recognition of her unusual personality and talents. These include, as I said, Professor Wunsch, a wandering and desolate musician who teaches Taya to play the piano, Dr. Archie, a lifelong friend and mentor who provides wisdom, insight, and fatherly concern, and Ray Kennedy, a brakeman on the railroad who bequeaths Taya enough money, oh, I'm giving this away, to allow her to go to Chicago to study music. So, Cather's very subtle in her descriptions of these characters. There's a lot of detail, but she doesn't come right out and say that these characters bequeath or give her these gifts towards the growth of her artistry. We see them doing it. Even her father and mother recognize her talent and do not prevent her from doing formal study far away in a big city. Her participation in the church choir, in local talent shows, and in the somewhat questionable festivities of Moonstone's Mexican town provide opportunities to display her musical talent and for town recognition as a promising musician. By age 15, she has quit high school to become the main piano teacher in the small town, but is frustrated by what appears to be a future clouded by frontier cultural limitations. Um, I just thought that was a nice summary um, of the contribution of these characters to her artistic development. So if we turn to the text, let's go to the text. So right off the bat, I'm sure you noticed that there was some lines at the beginning that are from Don Juan. So it says it was a wondrously lovely storm that drove me from Don Juan. And let's see, we have notes on Strauss. So the musician Strauss uh, also created an opera entitled Don Juan. These lines from Don Juan are from the Austrian, okay, that's it. The legend of Don Juan seems to have originated in the 16th century. The tale of the libertine nobleman who is damned for his numerous seductions and unwillingness to repent has found expression in several works. The Austrian poet and philosopher Nicholas Lenau offered his own slightly different perspective in his 1844 poem Don Juan, and that's what these lines are from. Um, my Don Juan is no hot-blooded man eternally pursuing women. That's the legend. Um, it is the longing in him to find a woman who is to him incarnate womanhood, and to enjoy in the one all the women on earth whom he cannot possess as individuals, because he does not find her, although he reels from one to another. At last disgust, and that's capitalized, disgust, seizes hold of him, and this disgust is the devil that fetches him. And it may not seem like it is immediately relevant to the novel, but Strauss was a contemporary of Wagner. And I'm sure you remember from last week that um, Cather, I almost called her Taya, Cather really, really identified with Wagner. Strauss was a contemporary, and he was writing poetry and opera at the same at a contemporary of Wagner. It is no. When Lenau's Don Juan is unable to find his womanly ideal, he allows himself to be killed in a duel, exclaiming, "My deadly foe is my power, and this too bores me, as does life itself." Richard Strauss was 24 when, in 1888, he first read Don Juan by Lenau. Strauss quickly began to compose an orchestral tone poem based on the Lenau work, completing his score in 1889. In that same year, Strauss was appointed assistant conductor in Weimar, and the 25-year-old Strauss conducted Don Juan's triumphant premiere. So, really, the relevance of this is the multi-layered connection to opera and to poetry, and for the longing of the self to find some ideal. Don Juan opens in bracing fashion with an upward orchestral flourish and the strings introduction of the vaulting theme associated throughout the work with the title character. A series of episodes follows depicting the Don's numerous conquests. Just when it appears that Don Juan will conclude in triumph, Strauss reminds us of his end, particularly as related in Lenau's poem. The flurry of activity slams to a halt. So, also, that connection is the longing of the soul for some kind of ideal. For Taya, it becomes the longing of the soul for an artistic ideal. But also, the title of our book we know came from that painting. I'm not even sure where I put my paper. But it was also a piano piece written by Tchaikovsky in 1878. It was in a book entitled, or a collection of pieces entitled Album for the Young. They were small piano solos for children. So, just again, another level of the connection to musicality. Okay, so let's go to the text. If we look to page 3, it begins with an introduction of Dr. Archie. This is based on the personality in Cather's world. His name was Dr. G.E. McKeeby, Mckeeby, McKeeby. He had just came from a game of pool with a Jewish clothier and 2 traveling men who happened to be staying overnight in Moonstone. So, okay. I've already told you this. Let's see. McKeeby was the prototype for Dr. Archie, had his office above the drugstore in the prestigious Moon Block in Red Cloud. Some of that's going to overlap, I think. If you go to the next couple lines down, there's something called isinglass sides of the hard coal burner. I didn't know what isinglass was, so of course I went to my friend Google. And isinglass, I think in this case, is meant to be very thin, maybe a little opaque glass. Actually, isinglass was also a reference to fish bladders, which were very thin sheets. Isinglass. I just thought you would think that was interesting. So, second paragraph, as the doctor in New England villages is proverbially, I can't even say that word. He was old, so the doctor in small Colorado towns 25 years ago was generally young. So, two things. First of all, the narrator is telling us that this is looking back to 25 years ago. Also, there's something very interesting about the doctor being being new in these Colorado towns. Remember that there had been quite a lot of migration westward, especially amongst immigrants. And so many of the people in the towns were young. Was there anything? Oh, my notes say that the novel begins in the mid 1880s when Cather herself was Taya's age. That parallel. We go to the next page, top of the page in that first complete paragraph. Dr. Archie turned up the student's lamp and sat down in the swivel chair before his desk. I just marked that because he's not just sitting down at a desk. We have a student lamp, and he sits in a swivel chair before his desk. The detail to me is absolutely compelling. If we look down towards it's like 2/3 of the way down. Altogether, there was a pretentious and important air about him as he lifted the skirts of his coat and sat down. This is Mr. Kronberg, who has come in, and this is Taya's father. You can just imagine what that looks like. In the back of a coat worn by men at the time, it was split. That we still see that, but it was split higher up so that he could sit on a horse. And so he would gather up the two sides and then plop himself down. I just thought, again, that was a really, really nice visual. There's something about Mr. Kronberg that tells us that he is a man of importance in the town. At the bottom, he controlled it only by calling upon his habitual pulpit manner. He's a minister. And that would give him importance. And he has come to see the doctor. He has maintained this important air, but we're learning a little bit on the next page that the missus appears to be ill or something. And it's really the or something that's interesting because she is in labor. And over at the top of page 5, I think it would be as well to go immediately. Mrs. Kronberg will be more comfortable if you are there. She has been suffering for some time. Distancing himself, it seems, from the current problem she's facing, which is her labor. Let's see, towards the bottom of page 5, again we see his posture as the minister. His nervous ministerial cough annoyed the doctor. Exactly as if he were going to give out a text, he thought. He drew off his glove and felt in his vest pocket. Have a troche, Kronberg, he said, producing some. Sent me for samples. Very good for the rough throat. A troche is a cough drop. And the minister's coughing, clearing his throat, and the doctor hands him a cough drop. That's what a troche is. I thought that was interesting. At the top of page 6, um, here's just a nice visual of the chaos of the Kronberg home. The front hall was dark and cold. The hat rack was hung with an astonishing number of children's hats and caps and cloaks. I, I, I marked that because I thought it was really reminiscent of when my children were little. They would just plop everything down in the back hall and it would just lay there. And I didn't have 7 kids, I only had 4. But I did have that astonishing number of children's hats and caps and cloaks and then the backpacks. Um, they were even piled on the table beneath the hat rack. I just thought that was such a great visual. In the next paragraph, the missus has successfully had her 7th child rather nonchalantly. Um, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Archie was in the parlor putting on his cuffs and coat. There was no spare bedroom in that house. Peter Kronberg's 7th child aboard, a boy, was being soothed and cosseted by his aunt. Mrs. Kronberg was asleep. So, uh, what I like, especially, it's throughout the whole book. Cather lays out these details and allows us to experience the setting or the personalities or like even the coughing of the minister and the cough drop. The detail really compels me, even though the critics say that it was probably heavy-handed. I didn't think so at all. So on the next page, page 7, we find the doctor discovering that Taya is quite ill. We do not know yet that Dr. Archie and Taya have a friendship, but he discovers over on the next page that she's very sick. In fact, she has pneumonia, and she must have been sick for several days. Put the baby down somewhere, please, and help me make up the bed lounge here in the parlor. She's got to be in a warm room, and she's got to be quiet. Now that we know quite a bit about the development of Taya's artistic self, we see here on the 7th page of the novel where she is separated from the others. It's as if Cather is laying little crumbs for us to see that somehow Taya is different from the others. In this case, she's different from the others simply because she's so ill. But it's a little clue from Cather. So they carry her into the parlor, and then if we go over to page 8, um, he was the doctor. This is the first complete paragraph at the top. The doctor caught his coat and hurried out into the dark street. Nobody was stirring yet, and the cold was bitter, kind of like today. And perhaps you have noticed that I've got my drapes pulled over there in an effort to keep it a little warmer in here. My furnace isn't even keeping up. So it's bitter. We all get what that is today, unless you're living elsewhere. And then you'll know that it was minus 12 yesterday. Minus 12. The idea, he muttered, to be such an ass at his age about the 7th. The minister likes his baby, but the doctor says he's an ass. And to feel no responsibility about the little girl. Silly old goat. The baby would have got into the world somehow. They always do. But a nice little girl like that, she's worth the whole litter. Again, a little hint. First of all, he calls them a litter, like puppies, because there's so many of them and they just make a mess, and they're all over the place. But this is a suggestion. She's worth the whole litter. A suggestion about her ability. Something is unusual about this child. Okay, down at the bottom of this second complete paragraph. Let's see, where does that sentence begin? There's a reference down at the bottom about Brussels carpet, Cerny's daily studies, which stood open on the upright piano. She forgot for the time being, all about the new baby. My notes say to myself that these daily studies were written by someone named Carl Czerny from 1791 to 1857. Those are his dates. He's a Viennese composer, pianist, and pedagogue whose 1854 Studies of Pianoforte was issued in America in 1881 as 40 daily studies. Um, an indicator that some child in this family is playing piano, and we just have another realistic little detail. But I did, since our book doesn't have notes, I thought I would share that with you. At the top of page 9, we see the doctor tending to Taya. He wrapped the hot plaster about her chest. There seemed to be straps which he pinned over her shoulders. Then he took out a thread and needle and began to sew her up in it. That, she felt, was too strange. She must be dreaming anyhow, so she succumbed to her drowsiness. I've heard of hot plasters. I've seen them in other texts, but I wasn't absolutely sure what it is. It is, in this case, it's a mush of things that are sticky that then they smeared on each other, when someone was ill, and it was supposed to warm the muscles. I think it's like that Vicks Vapor Rub stuff. You put that on there and it kind of drifts up into your nose. He puts this, and it warms the muscle and supposedly increases the blood flow. I don't think we do that. I never put that on my kids, but I wanted to know what that was. She's referred to in the next paragraph as a little Swede through and through. Her hands so little and hot, so clever. Again, another little nugget about her, the interesting element about her. He glanced at the open exercise book on the piano. When he had stitched up the flaxseed jacket, he wiped it neatly about the edges where the paste had worked out to the skin. The flaxseed jacket is Taya's poultice. It's designed to relieve chest congestion. Ground flaxseed was mixed to a paste with hot water, then applied to back and chest. A jacket was commonly sewed tightly over it to keep it in place. That's kind of an interesting tidbit. He couldn't say, a few lines later, he couldn't say that it was different from any other child's head, though he believed that there was something very different about her. I don't know if you were noticing these things as you were going along, the hints that Cather is giving us about the unusual complexity of this child. Let's see, she's a hard little Scandinavian face, as if some fairy godmother had caressed her there and left a cryptic promise. At the end, I'm on page 10, at the end of this chapter, her affection for him was prettier than most of the things that went to make up the doctor's life in Moonstone. There we have it. They are indeed friends. And there's nothing untoward about it. It's just that she has unusual friends and an unusual brain. If we look into the next chapter, there is something here that I marked in the middle of the second paragraph. Nothing of him was visible. This is of the baby, the seventh child. Nothing of him was visible but a flushed, puffy forehead and an uncompromisingly big, bald cranium. I'm sure everybody's had one of those. I had one of my kids had a big, bald head. Hilarious. At the bottom of page 10, Mrs. Kronberg was a woman whom Dr. Archie respected, active, practical, unruffled, good-humored, but determined. That's I suppose, the characterization of the Swedish immigrant. Exactly the sort of woman to take care of a flighty preacher. She had brought her husband some property too, 1/4 of her father's broad acres in Nebraska, but this she kept in her own name. You think to yourself, you go girl. down at the bottom, or no, a few lines later. But for all this, she had no confidence in his administration of worldly affairs, so she took them over. So we're getting a picture of the dynamics of the Kronberg family. The mom's in charge, and the dad is he loves his little kids more than one might expect. Not that good at the details, though. At the end of the page, or the end of the paragraph on page 11, with all his flightiness, Peter Kronberg associated the matter-of-fact, punctual way in which his wife got her children into the world and along in it. He believed, and he was right in believing, that the sovereign state of Colorado was much indebted to Mrs. Kronberg and women like her. That's a portrait of these immigrants that Cather used to know in her hometown. And she was like Taya in that she befriended weird people, immigrant women, old immigrant women. Um, towards the next, or in the next paragraph, second sentence, more modern views would not have startled her. They would simply have seemed foolish, thin chatter, like the boasts of the men who built the Tower of Babel. Or, oh yeah, I have a note on that one. But I'm sure you know what the Tower of Babel is. That's that biblical reference to in Genesis 11, 1 through 9. At a time when all the world spoke a single language, the Babylonians tried to distinguish themselves by building a tower that would reach to heaven. God punished their arrogance by confusing their speech, i.e., Babel became Babel. I just wanted to, you probably know that story anyway. She was calm and even-tempered, naturally kind. She was capable of strong prejudices and never forgave. Nice picture of this immigrant woman who is really a portrait of these immigrant prairie people. On the next page, page 12, we're getting another little insight into the relationship between Taya and Dr. Archie. Before the doctor picked up the baby, he put a yellow paper bag down on Taya's coverlid and winked at her. They had a code of winks and grimaces, as if they have their own language. And they do, because in the future, he is going to, and one of our critics told us this, he is going to tell her things about life and religion as if she were an adult. They have their own kind of language. So he's given her a bag of green grapes. That's what those, what is that? Malaga grapes in Moonstone. They're green grapes. Not maybe the big ones that you get at Sendex, but these are pale green, smaller green grapes. My guess is that people were growing grapes there. Down at the bottom of page 12, he was quite as shy as his patient, especially when a third person overheard his conversation. Big and handsome and superior to his fellow townsmen as Dr. Archie was, he was seldom at his ease, and like Peter Kronberg, he often dodged behind a professional manner. So, whereas one is ministerial, the other one is superior and scientific. If we look at the top of page 13, we meet Professor Wunsch. He's the piano teacher. Mid-paragraph, Dr. Archie says, he says, I don't know if any of your kids ever did this, but my kids did. They liked rocks, especially my son. If we would ever go into the gift shop at a like a national park, there was always for sale in the middle. You could buy rocks, and I needed always to buy these rocks. I think my son still has a box of rocks somewhere in this house that we moved from my other house. And if anybody here lives in Cedarburg, there's a rock store I'm not even sure how something like that can stay in business, except I see people going in and out of there all the time. People like rocks, and so does Taya. Dr. Archie laughed. It's an opal. Spanish Johnny brought it for me from Chihuahua in his shoe. I had it set in Denver, and I wore it today for your benefit. So she likes rocks, and we'll see her going out into the desert and picking up shiny bits that she likes. But the interesting thing about the word opal is that it is also known as moonstone. And I didn't know that. I didn't make the connection, but that is in one of my notes. Um, so let's see. There's a reference here to some pink Sidoni. That's a quartz. And then she's reading, of course. What are you reading? The doctor reached under the covers and pulled out a book of Byron's poems. Um, and Byron, of course, is the ultimate romantic. And let's see what my note here says. Where is my note? Oh, I think I'm on the wrong page. Oh yeah. Um, the really helpful thing about having your cell phone, mine is off this time, thank you very much, but it holds my papers down so I don't lose my place. Um, so My Native Land, Good Night is from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, enormously popular work by the Romantic poet Lord Byron. Childe Harold is the earliest of the extravagant Byronic heroes, a melancholy, defiant outcast who wanders about Europe, reflecting on nature, his own states of mind, and historical and contemporary people and events. Um, in some ways, that is suggestive of what is going to of Taya's life. She's going to, in fact, um, go from city to city on this um, trail of discovery of her own artistic temperament. And the ultimate in music of artistry, certainly for Cather, is opera. Highly romantic. So some parallels. Um, Maid of Athens is that's another Byron poem. Becomes known by its first line, "Maid of Athens, ere we part." And then there's another reference to Byron at the top of page 14. There was the Sound of Revelry, which is from Canto 3, stanza 21, again of Childe Harold. Of course, she's reading that. It just totally makes sense. Uh, then we have the baby has been named, and like Taya, the baby's name is Tor. We don't really find that out for a couple of pages, but they've named him Tor, and she's Taya, again reflective of the fact that they are immigrants. Taya frowned again, still more fiercely, and said quickly, "That's a nice name, only maybe it's a little old-fashioned." She was very sensitive about being thought a foreigner, and was proud of the fact that in town her father always preached in English, very bookish English, at that, one might add. So, a little sensitivity. I just think it's an interesting point about the immigrant mentality. Down at the bottom of page 14, the poor man had no natural, spontaneous human speech. If he had his sincere moments, they were perforce inarticulate. Probably a good deal of his pretentiousness, this is the minister dad, was due to the fact that he habitually expressed himself in a book learned language, wholly remote from anything personal, native, or homely. And yet we know that he is a feeling man because he was, so to speak, making an ass of himself of his seventh child. You would think maybe by then he was tired of them. Um, but that is not the case. We get another little insight into the family dynamics. There's this sister-in-law, Tilly, who is, I think she's a spinster, and but she's maybe not as well. She is definitely not as gifted as Taya. Tilly is She's the sister-in-law. She speaks colloquial English to her neighbors. Taya, who had rather a sensitive ear until she went to school, neither spoke at all except in monosyllables, and her mother was convinced that she was tongue-tied. She was still inept in speech for a child so intelligent. So there's parallels here. The dad is inarticulate except in his own realm, and the doctor except in his own realm, and Taya, she hasn't come into her own realm yet. We will see how that unfolds. Her ideas were usually clear, but she seldom attempted to explain them, even at school, where she excelled in written work and never did more than mutter a reply. Perhaps a shy child. So there's a reference to Wunsch and his drinking habits. She says, I don't care if he does drink, he's old and poor. Her voice shook a little. She's defending Wunsch. We go over to page 16. This is an interesting chapter inasmuch as Cather, sometimes I get Cather and Taya mixed up in my head, the names. This is interesting because Cather gives us pictures of the children's apparel, and it's definitely ethnic. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see much of. Well, these are pretty good pictures. This is traditional Scandinavian Swedish wear, and these two little girls, of course, are they their parents have dressed them up in this, but this is what the girls would be wearing. I was really looking for a picture of the apron that Taya wears over all of her clothes until she puts on her cloak to go to school. I couldn't find that, and I'm wondering if it is just it's something I think to keep the little girl's clothes clean. But here you see that is we you see the apron right here, and this is an underblouse, but you see that the apron covers the woolen skirt below. So this is something similar to what these little Kronberg girls were wearing. I liked the beginning of this chapter because you can hear some of Cather's humor. Being sick was all very well. I can take this off now. But Taya knew from experience that starting back to school again was attended by depressing difficulties. My kids always like to stay home. They would sit and watch who knows what, Jeopardy. A few lines later, the first and the worst thing that confronted Taya was a suit of clean, prickly wet red flannel, fresh from the wash. And it's not flannel like the soft jammies that we now wear. This is woolen underwear, which the kids all had to wear under their clothing. Usually the torment of breaking in a clean suit of flannel came on Sunday, but yesterday, as she was staying in the house, she had begged off. Their winter underwear, I think this is really funny, was a trial to all of the children, but it was bitterest to Taya because she happened to have the most sensitive skin. Of course she does, because she's the most sensitive child, intellectually. But I thought that the picture of the red underwear was really entertaining. My kids always hated their Sunday clothes because it was itchy. Everything was itchy. Um, the little reference here to at the top of page 17 to Mrs. Kronberg's rawhide whip, telling you, of course, that she's a disciplinarian. Only a somewhat stern system of discipline could have kept any degree of order and quiet in that overcrowded house. I just find these details interesting. At the end of the next second next paragraph. She respected them as individuals. This is Mrs. Kronberg of her own children. And outside of the house, they had a great deal of liberty, but their communal life was definitely ordered. Um, this, I don't know how big this house is, but it isn't big enough for all those kids. Um, some funny language on page 18. Tilly was a queer, addlepated thing. That's really funny. I'm almost going to need to remember that. She, addle-headed is essentially, so she's kind of dingy. At 35 and as flighty as a girl and overweeningly fond of gay clothes. Just middle of this paragraph, she had a complete set of standard recitations which she conned on Sundays. The That's just a reference to something by by Standard Recitations by Best Authors, compiled by Frances Pauline Sullivan in 1883. So this is just, I think it's a book of quotes. Over on the top of page 19, we get some of Tilly's speech. Tilly was turning buckwheat cakes on the griddle. Taya can play and sing. She don't need to speak, but you've got to know how to do something, Gunner. That you have. She's talking about Gunner needing to become educated. What are you going to do when you get big and want to get into society if you can't do nothing? Everybody'll say, "Can you sing? Can you play? Can you speak?" Then get right out of society. That is her vision of society. So in a couple of pages, we're going to get to the point where Cather distinguishes by location the different levels of society, and what Tilly is talking about are the high society people. And if you can't sing and if you can't play, then you can't speak, then out you go, high society. But Cather tells us that those are dumb ideas. In the next chapter, there is begins with, and it was summer, beautiful summer. That is from Hans Christian Andersen, her Taya's favorite short story, fairy tale is The Snow Queen from Hans Christian Andersen. But I like these lines because in a couple more paragraphs, we're going to see Taya traveling about town at the early part of May. It was summer, and she's beginning to, how kids do it, anticipate the freedom from school. At the top of page 20, there's a paragraph, and I just wrote in the margin, note the detail. It was in the summer that one really lived. Then all the little overcrowded houses were opened wide, and the wind blew through them with sweet earthy smells of garden planting. The town looked as if it had been just washed. People were out painting their fences. The cottonwood trees were aflicker. Cather often mentions cottonwood trees. We'll get to that in a minute. The trees were aflicker with sticky yellow little leaves, and the feathery tamarisks were in pink bud. Again, that's another tree that appears in the novel quite a bit. I'll get to that. With the warm weather came freedom for everybody. People were dug up, as it were. The very old people, I like that image a lot, especially on a day like today where nobody can go outside because it's too cold. I don't know what the temperature is now, but when I got up, it was 2 below. And who even wants to go out in that? When you go to Piggly Wiggly, your nose freezes shut. Very old people whom one had not seen all winter came out and sunned themselves in the yard. The double windows were taken off the houses. The tormenting flannels in which children had been encased all winter were put away in boxes, and the youngsters felt a pleasure in the cool cotton things next to their skin. And I just think that the lovely, lovely detail. There are visuals. There are also feelings like the itchy underwear. Um, it really tells us how much Taya enjoys the summer. There's a reference in the next paragraph to the adobe houses where the Mexican lived. She's walking through the town, and we'll visit the Mexicans. I'm not sure exactly where this is, but the Mexicans drifted in slowly, and then suddenly they found themselves in the Mexican Quarter. Mrs. Kohler, down at the bottom, seldom crossed the ravine and went into the town except at Christmas time. So now Cather's going to give us some portraits of some of these peculiar people in the town. Everybody's got peculiar people in town. Let's hope it's not us. Mrs. Kohler seldom crossed the ravine, but then we get some descriptions of her at the top of page 21. Another one of these eccentrics. She made her own dresses. The skirts came barely to her shoe tops and were gathered as full as they could possibly be to the waistband. She preferred men's shoes and usually wore the cast-offs of one of her sons. I just liked the clothing. At the end of this paragraph, above the cherry trees and peach trees and golden plums stood the windmill. And I hope you noted that. These people are Scandinavian. That's where windmills are. And it's not those big white things that, fly around in central Iowa. It's the beautiful kind, the Dutch kind, with its tank on stilts, which kept all this verdure alive. Mrs. Kohler, though she doesn't go to church, does cultivate maybe what is like paradise. Outside, the sagebrush grew up to the very edge of the garden, and the sand was always drifting up to the tamarisks. The tamarisks are because I don't have a color printer, sometimes I don't print things because really the important thing is the color. These tamarisks are flowering trees and bushes, and they have pink and very varying colors of pink flowers, and they're quite beautiful. Next paragraph. Everyone in Moonstone was astonished when the Kohlers took the wandering music teacher to live with them. So Wunsch, sorry, Wunsch appears out of nowhere, and he just begins to live with the Kohlers. In 17 years, old Fritz had never had a crony except the harness maker and Spanish Johnny. This Wunsch came from God knew where, followed Spanish Johnny into town when that wanderer came back from one of his tramps. More wandering people. Foreshadowing some of the wandering that we're going to see Taya do. She doesn't really wander aimlessly like these two characters, but she does go on her journey. If we go to the next page, page 22, Professor Wunsch went to the houses of other pupils to give them their lessons, but one morning he told Mrs. Kronberg that Taya had talent, and that if she came to him, he could teach her in his slippers, and that would be better. I'm not sure why. Mrs. Kronberg was a strange woman. That word talent, which no one else in Moonstone, not even Dr. Archie, would have understood, she comprehended perfectly. So Mrs. Kronberg is a disciplinarian, a typical Scandinavian immigrant, and yet she understands the talent of her child. And if we look in a few lines later, a child with talent must be kept at the piano, just as a child with measles must be kept under the blankets. It's a very practical analogy, but I thought it was entertaining. Next line, their father had played the oboe in an orchestra in Sweden before he came to America to better his fortunes. He had even known Jenny Lind. Jenny Lind was nicknamed the Swedish Nightingale. Her dates were 1820 to 1857. 1887 was one of the most admired singers of the Victorian era. Her 2-year concert tour of the United States in 1850 to 1851 began under the showman P.T. Barnum, who turned her tour into a media event. An interesting side. So Mr. Kronberg's father had even known her. That's like, knowing a movie star. At the top of page 23, old Fritz and Witch, however, indulged in a friendly bottle pretty often. Old Fritz, of course, is uh, Mr. Kohler. The two men were like comrades. Perhaps the bond between them was the glass wherein lost hopes were found. Perhaps it was common memories of another country. Here's a portrait of the immigrant mentality. Perhaps it was common memories of another country. Perhaps it was the grapevine in the garden, the knotty, fibrous shrub, full of homesickness and sentiment, which the Germans have carried around the world with them. So Cather tells us that these people are immigrants and have the immigrant mentality. At the end of the next paragraph, I'm still on page 23, very end. Besides the fruit trees, there was a great umbrella-shaped catalpa and a balm of Gilead, 2 lindens, and even a ginkgo, a rigid pointed tree with leaves shaped like butterflies. That I thought that was a very beautiful description of the leaves on a ginkgo tree. They are like butterflies. There was a ginkgo tree planted outside the library at my college, and if you know anything about the tree, there's a male tree and a female tree, and one of them has fruit that stinks. It stinks a lot. And that tree had been mistakenly planted. I think it was the female tree, outside of the library door. So the fruit would drop down and people would walk on the fruit and drag the smell into the library. There's a fun fact to know and tell. But I liked this idea that the leaves were shaped like butterflies instead of the emphasis on the smelly fruit. Next paragraph. This morning, Taya saw to her delight that the 2 oleander trees, one white and one red, had been brought out from their winter quarters in the cellar. Not only are these young men, the brothers, carrying these trees up and down, but I looked up. I don't have any oleander. I have a lot of trees, but I don't have any oleander, and it's because they're poisonous. If you touch the leaves to your skin, it's irritating. So these boys have to carry these pots up and down. There's no mention of the fact that it must give them a rash. On the top of the next page, 24, when Taya entered the great gate, her professor leaned his spade against the white post that supported the turreted dove house and wiped his face with his shirt sleeve. Some way he never managed to have a handkerchief about him. These are the details about the professor. And I think this is where critics did take Cather for task, because the detail is it's so much, but I really, really enjoyed it. He's short and stocky, and we get to near the end, his hair was cropped close, iron gray bristles on a bullet-like head. I thought that was funny. So he's got a pointy head. Um, Next paragraph. 2 paragraphs. To Mrs. Kohler in the garden came the cheerful sound of the effort of vigorous striving. Vigorous striving, that's Taya. She isn't just plinking along on the piano, she is vigorously striving, again setting her apart from the other pupils. Unconsciously, she, meaning Mrs. Kohler, wielded her rake more lightly. Occasionally, she heard the teacher's voice, scale of E minor, weiter, weiter. I think that means continue, continue. Emer, I hear the thumb, like a lame foot. Weiter, weiter, once. Schön. The chords, quick. So he's got a German accent and speaks partly in German to her, but you can determine from that how he's really trying to discipline her. In the next paragraph, there is a reference to a Clementi sonata, which is a reference to an Italian-born, English-educated child prodigy pianist. Composer, teacher, and piano manufacturer, regarded as the first genuine composer for the piano. And if we knew that Clementi was a child prodigy, we are looking at another prodigy. but we don't know that yet. At the top of page 25, Herr Wunsch grinned. How soon is it you are free from school? Then we make ahead faster, eh? First week in June. Then will you give me the invitation to the dance? It was a piece written by Weber, or it's really Weber, in 1819. She must like that piece. There are lines from Ovid in the middle of the paper, middle of the page, I mean. She asks him, she's reading Ovid, which tells you the level of intellect that we're seeing. And she's still really young. And she doesn't know these words that are written in Latin. And he wrote in a clear, elegant Gothic hand the English version. Go slowly, ye steeds of the night. Um, I believe this is a suggestion. First of all, it triggers memories in Wunsch, but it's also kind of defining Tea's progress. Go slowly, ye steeds of the night. So we have several paragraphs here where he has memories, suggesting that he was educated, has an intellect as well. So the lesson is over, and there is Theo then confers with Mrs. Kohler, this odd woman with high skirts and men's boots, about a picture piece. I did not know what a picture piece was, and I couldn't find a photo of it. But it is something in this paragraph. It says that Fritz Kohler had made this. It was a kind of mosaic. The pupil was allowed to select his subject, and Fritz Kohler had chosen a popular painting in Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. So what he has done, he has made in fabric something that was probably like this. This is Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. And there's a picture of Napoleon sitting on his big white horse and his troops laying about him. Let's see, what was the... I had words about it. Let's see what it is. In any case, I'll find it. He created this. Oh, it is in 6 and 7. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, sought to incorporate Russia into his empire, but his disastrous 1812 military campaign there marked the turning point in his career. In the face of his grand armée of 500,000 troops, the Russian troops fell back, systematically devastating the land and burning the city of Moscow with all its supplies. Napoleon's troops were left starving and exposed to the brutal Russian winter. Only a fifth survived the journey home. So you can see in this painting, it was clearer in the color photo, but you can see in the painting that in the town, that the town in the background is burning. And you can see the troops falling. And in a close-up of that, Napoleon's face was dejected. Wunsch's peace picture seems to have been modeled after one that hung in the office of an Austrian tailor in Pittsburgh, where Cather lived between 1896 and 1906. Cather wrote admiringly of it in a letter, admitting that she felt deprived at never having had to look at it when she was a child. Including it in her novel, she explained, was her revenge on Fortune, capital F, for having prevented her from enjoying such a thing as a child. So now we see Thea, who loves this picture piece better than anything in the Kohler's home. Just a side, I thought that was really interesting. On Sunday, when I go by the church down at the bottom of 26 goes Wunsch, I hear you sing something. Taya obediently sat down on the stool again and began, Come ye disconsolate. The hymn by Thomas Moore, set to a German air, published in 1816. Okay. Such a beautiful child's voice. Here's a little crumb that we are getting about what's to come. There is on the floor in this home a rag carpet. I had an aunt who used to make rag carpets. She would take rags and uh, things that were discarded and braid them. And then there would be these long braids, and she would sew them into a circle. And then you would have these rag rugs. I think that's what that looks like. And then there's also the cretonne pillows. That's just a heavy cotton with floral prints on it. And in this case, they're faded. Towards right in the middle of this page, we have Wunsch again thinking about those lines, go slowly, ye steeds of the night. It triggers in him memory. And so we get a greater picture of him personally. At the bottom of page 27, he had played in orchestras that were never paid and wandering opera troupes which disbanded penniless. And there was always the old enemy, more relentless than the others. It was long since he had wished anything or desired anything beyond the necessity. The lines at the top of the next page give us some insight into Wunsch and his own personal fears. Now that he was tempted to hope for another, he felt alarmed and shook his head. He has hope for Taya, and he's afraid. He's afraid that he will damage it by hoping it. It was his pupil's power of application, her rugged will, that interested him. He had lived for so long among people whose sole ambition was to get something for nothing that he had learned not to look for seriousness in anyone. And if you are a note taker, this is a piece, a section that requires a star, because this tells him, it tells us about his insight into Taya. People are beginning to recognize her unusual capacity. What was it she reminded him of? A yellow flower full of sunlight, perhaps. No, a thin glass full of sweet-smelling, sparkling Moselle wine. He seemed to see such a glass before him in the arbor, to watch the bubbles rising and breaking, and like the silent discharge of energy in the nerves and brain. I think this description is just brilliant. This discharge of energy in nerves and brain, the rapid fluorescence of young blood. Wunsch felt ashamed and dragged his slippers along the path to the kitchen, his eyes on the ground. He recognizes this in him, but he fears that he will cause it damage. And so he kind of slinks off, hoping against hope that something might come of Artea. I think we'll stop here. I've been going about an hour and a half, and you'll notice that I didn't even turn it off, and I didn't get interrupted by barking dogs or my telephone. So I will stop here, and we will resume page 28 next week. Any of you who have ever taken any of my classes know that I always get behind. Always. But it's because I get tangled up in the background, which I find immensely interesting because it really gives us light into our characters. So if you have questions over the week, feel free to let me know, and I can address things during our next class. And with that, I will close and upload it. It's 10:20 right now for me. You'll be watching this later this afternoon. I've discovered that uploading these sometimes to YouTube takes hours, and I'm not even sure why. Because I guess the video is long, but it should be to you by 2 o'clock or so this afternoon. Anytime in the future, if it gets to you late, it's because it takes so long. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I will talk to you next week. Have a good week. Everybody be well.